My name's Gary, and I'm a developer advocate for PhpStorm at JetBrains. It's worth noting that any questions you have, anything you'd like to know, you can always tweet at me at GWEH, and I'll answer any questions, not just ones about debugging. So yeah, let's make a start. So this is kind of a gentle introduction into debugging. And it's an introduction to what debugging is, how you can use it, and how you can configure PHP and PhpStorm to interact with each other in order for you to be able to successfully step debug. So let's make a start. So, the first question is, why bother with sort of step debugging? Well, yeah, in the beginning, we've been using var dump or printr pretty much forever, and that just dumps the contents of the screen, and that's useful. Let's not pretend that that isn't useful. Var dumping things to the screen in a way like you can see there is still a very valid way of debugging. So in this instance, we're just dumping the countries array to the screen or the console, and we can see exactly what's going on inside that variable. In this instance, we've got an array of objects. It's still really, really useful. Let's not pretend that this is going to replace you var dumping things out to the console or var dumping you things out to the browser. It's still incredibly useful. This is not a replacement for var dump. This is kind of an extension on it. So var dump is great in most instances, but then you end up sort of looking at doing things like this. So this is part of Doctrine ORM. So you can see here that what we're doing is we're trying to understand the flow, what exactly is happening here. So we're echoing out first if, and then we're echoing out, oh, the delete switch clause has been hit, or the update or the default switch clause has been hit. And then right at the bottom there, we're var dumping out the actual variable. And this will be familiar to everyone. I've done tons and tons of code like this. And it's in this situation where you need to understand the flow and what decision your code is making in when var dump just doesn't cut the mustard or echoing things out. You really need a little bit more help. And this is where step debugging can be really, really useful to you. So there's a few things we need to know before we can start debugging. The first thing we'll need is an actual, excuse me. Well, the first thing we need is an extension to enable debugging in PHP. So PHP doesn't come with debugging enabled by default. You need to kind of install an extra extension. There's a few of them available. You've got Xdebug that comes particularly defaultly installed with Zen Server. And my particular favorite is Xdebug. Xdebug is just a PHP extension. It allows you to step debug stuff. It also gives you like prettier exception messages and stack traces. It allows you to profile your scripts. It does a ton of stuff as well as debugging. But step debugging is its primary use. It's written by this very nice man called Derek Rathans, who's written this as a PHP extension. He's also responsible for the daytime implementation. So you can always thank Derek. His Twitter handle is right down the left-hand side there. So it's a complete separate extension for PHP, and it works in a really weird way, and this is kind of worth mentioning. There's two parts to the communication. It's a typical client-server communication. So basically what we have here is a client communicating with the server and then the server responding back to the client. So it's pretty typical client-server relationship. The interesting part here is that PHP, in this instance, is the client, and then your IDE, in our case, PhpStorm, is going to be your server. So it's worth remembering that, because sometimes you get a little bit confused when you're asking questions and you're asking for help, and people will mention client and server. It's worth remembering that PHP is the client and PhpStorm is the server in that relationship. A quick point of note, other IDEs are available. Obviously, because this is a JetBrains webinar, we're going to be talking about PhpStorm. But this is available in all IDEs, really, all good IDEs. So if you're not a PhpStorm user, you can still get this stuff working in your own IDE. We're more interested in making sure that people are using the best tools they can to do the best job. So don't think this is only something that's in PhpStorm. This is available in many other IDEs too. I won't be able to help you configure those other IDEs because it can be quite painful, but certainly you can do it. So the first thing we have to do is to install the Xdebug extension. This is fairly straightforward, as is installing any extensions. OS X, you can just use your package manager. If you're using Brew, which I find is the easiest way to manage PHP installs on OS X, you can just do brew install PHP version number -xdebug. So that version would be 5.6 or 7.0, depending on what you're running. Obviously, it could be older than that, but then you're running on a version that's not supported anymore. Linux, kind of the same thing, apt-get install or yum install, very, very simple. And Windows is pretty straightforward. I used to have good luck on that slide, but since I'm working and developing on a Windows machine now, it's actually really, really easy. The only trick with Windows is to know whether you're running the 32 or 64-bit binary and whether you're running thread safe or non-thread safe. So that's all you need to know to get this working in Windows. It's really, really easy. So once you've installed Xdebug, then you should be able to confirm that it's actually running by using a php-v. And you can see right here that right at the bottom there, it says with Xdebug and then the version number. So that will tell you that Xdebug is installed and configured and enabled. If you don't see that, you're going to need to enable it by hand. And we're going to need to do some configuration anyway, so we're going to cover that in the next few slides. The next thing you want to do is run php-ini to find out which ini file is the additional ini file which has got the Xdebug information in. If you've installed this using the package manager, you will typically see an extra ini file being parsed, as you can see here. So you'll want to edit that. If not, then you can just edit your the default loaded configuration file. So in this instance, use a local etc php 5.6 php.ini. So you can just add this configuration right on default php.ini, or if you've installed it via a package manager, it will have created this extra Xdebug configuration file for you. It's fairly straightforward. And then what we need to do is to edit that file and basically make sure the configuration looks like this. Notice I'm using Vim in this example because you can't use one tool for everything, So what we need here is the square brackets and the Xdebug. That's just a section header. It's pretty much ignored by PHP when it parses this config file. The important things here are that we're using Zend_extension to load Xdebug, and we're passing in the complete full path to the actual xdebug.so file. So you need to remember that needs to be the complete full path. And then there's only two configurations we need to get this to work in the 90% work case, use case. Basically, these two settings will make this Xdebug and PhpStorm work for nearly all of the situations you can find. So you need xdebug.remote_enable equals on, but that just turns remote debugging on across the board. And then xdebug.remote_connect_back equals on. This is kind of the key setting here. If you've tried to configure Xdebug in the past, you may have noticed it's been quite painful. You've had to put the IP address of the machine that was running the server, and they'll get the right port and an IDE key and all sorts of other stuff that makes things fairly complicated. But basically, remote connect back says whichever IP address makes the request, send the debug data straight back to that IP address. So this works if you're developing locally. This setting will work fine. If you're developing on Vagrant or any other virtualized environment, this will also work fine because the IP address that's making the connect to the virtual machine will be the host. So it'll send the debug data back to the host. So this works fine for virtualized environments, for local environments, and it also works fine for containerized environments. So if you're using Docker, for example, then this will work perfectly well for that. So this is kind of the minimum amount of configuration you need to do that works for the maximum amount of situations. You may get small problems if you're on an edge case. If you're using really weird NAT rules in your Vagrant setup or networking rules, then you may find that you need to actually specify more configuration. Also, if you're developing locally, and you're running PHP FPM and Nginx as a local development environment, you may need to change your ports because both Xdebug and PHP FPM may both be listed on port 9000. Drop me a tweet if you need more help with this. There's also more documentation on the internet. I'll show you that at the end. So this is how you install and enable Xdebug. It's pretty straightforward, basically, you know, this should be a fairly easy step to do. If it's not, then please get in touch and we'll see if we can help you out. Yes, so to answer Vittoria's question, yes, this works with Vagrant. This absolutely works with most Vagrant configurations. As I said, if you have a weird network configuration, you may need to set up stuff like SSH tunnels and all things because you've got a really interesting network connection. But this will definitely work with a pretty standard Vagrant setup. I did also see a question if this works with PhpStorm 8. Yes, this will work with PhpStorm 8, but you may need to do some more configuration because I don't think the zero configuration debugging came in until later on. But certainly Xdebug and PhpStorm 8 will allow you to step debug. It just might take some more configuration. And works with IntelliJ MAMP? Yes, it should work with IntelliJ MAMP. This exact configuration I just showed should work with everything. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Jacob asks, configuration like ID key, IP address, port is no longer required if using remote connect back. Absolutely correct. Yes, that one line, that actual one line kind of takes care of everything. So we don't need to specify anything else. As long as we're not using atypical ports, then everything will just work. Cool. So there's a point of note here that I always kind of feel like I should mention. Yeah, you know, never ever use Xdebug in production. I know people will come back and say, "Oh, I've used in production and it was fine," and absolutely, it's a risk you can take. But I feel like it's definitely worth mentioning that using Xdebug in production is something that kind of seems like a good idea at the time, but will end up kind of biting you. Because you're opening up all sorts of information that you may or may not actually realize you're opening up. And with Xdebug enabled, if somebody can get hold of the port and you've configured it badly, they can basically get hold of all of your source code. So yes, I would say that the easiest thing to do is to not use Xdebug in production at all. Certainly think about it 3 or 4 times before actually doing it. So the next thing we need to do is to tell Xdebug we want to debug. So while Xdebug is always enabled, once it's loaded, it doesn't actually by default allow you to debug any request. So what we actually have to do is on the requests that we want to debug, we need to actually tell Xdebug, I'd like to debug this request. So we can do that by either passing in a query string parameter or setting a cookie. Either way, we use xdebug underscore session equals and an ID key. Just to reiterate, PhpStorm no longer cares what the ID key is since zero configuration debugging came in, which I believe is PhpStorm 10. But I'm not 100% that it was 10, but I think it was. But we basically just need to say, this is a request I want to do it with either a cookie or a query string parameter. So query string parameter just looks like this. We just pass xdebug underscore session equals and then anything. Setting a cookie is kind of a little bit more tricky, but luckily most browsers have a helper kind of extension that allows us to quickly and easily turn the cookie on and off. So this is Chrome Xdebug helper. Works perfectly well. And then basically all we need to do is to use this extension to turn debugging on or off in our browser. This is kind of the easiest way to turn debugging on and off, I find. It's much easier than just setting the query string. Just click the thing in your browser and you're debugging and then turn it off when you're finished. And it just sets the session. It basically just sets the cookie that we discussed earlier on. So this is a nice, cool, easy way to do that. And I'll show you, I'll use Firefox to debug later on, and I'll show you how that works. So how does debugging actually work? Basically, we have the client, which is PHP, and we have the server, which is a PhpStorm. So when a debugging session is requested by to Xdebug, Xdebug will say to oh, sorry, I went one too far. Xdebug will say to a PhpStorm on the port that's default 9000. Hi, are you an Xdebug server? And then PhpStorm will reply to PHP and say, yes, I am. Can I have a list of, here's a list of all the breakpoints I'm interested. We'll cover them in a moment. And then when one of those breakpoints is hit, execution will stop and PHP will sit there waiting for instructions from the server. And then the server will issue those instructions one at a time until such a time as the debug session ends. So very, very basic interaction. But the point is, if you can't, if PHP cannot actually get a response on the port it's expecting at the hello step, then nothing will work. So basically, this is a really, really simple overview of how the communication happens. So it's worth mentioning what breakpoints are. So we could quite happily just start at line 1 of the file that you're requesting and step debug all the way to the point where you're having a problem, but obviously this would be incredibly tedious and incredibly slow. So what we tend to do is to set up conditions where execution of PHP stops and we can inspect the state of the code and then start debugging from there. And these are a list of breakpoints. So these are a list of conditions when execution should stop and control should be passed to the server, to PhpStorm. So these are breakpoints. Please break at this point and pass control to the server. So assuming we've got Xdebug installed and configured and we have set the cookie, now we just need to tell PhpStorm to listen. This is really, really simple. So there's a little icon in the top toolbar in PhpStorm, and don't worry, I will be doing live demonstrations of this, right now, in fact. So we just click the button so that instead of the red circle with the lines through it, we get the little sort of listening icon. And that means that PhpStorm is happily sitting there waiting for debug information to come in. So if you want to use debugging, the question is, how do you use debugging with Postman instead of Chrome or Firefox? If you pass in that query string that I mentioned, xdebug_session equals something, and to answer Rick's question, yes, it does need to be all uppercase, then you can basically pass that in with Postman. You can even set a cookie with Postman or with curl. So you can definitely invoke these sessions, not just from within your browser. And you can also invoke them from command line scripts like your unit tests. I'll show you how to do that a bit later on. So let's move on. So let's we've kind of spoken now for 17 minutes and I've waffled on and tried to give you a background, but there's nothing like seeing to learn quickly. So I guess the best thing we can do here is to actually take a quick look at and then compares the answers. Obviously it's, oh, I think I just had a blip in my internet there, as there's a few people complaining about the audio. It's back. Okay, assuming that you can still hear, everyone can still hear me. If not, I'll assume that Anna will jump in and tell me. Then we can see PhpStorm right here on the screen, and you can see that I'm going to roll a dice twice and compare the answer. And that's a really, really simple script. I'm just running PHP's built-in web server to serve this page up. So if we go back to the browser and refresh the page, you can see that we haven't had any matches, and if we did have a match, we'd expect this to update. So this is a really, really simple script, but it's a really good script for us to introduce debugging. So the first thing we want to do is to set a breakpoint. So I'm going to set a breakpoint right here on line 5. It's worth noting that the breakpoint here on line 5 is going to be hit before line 5 is run. So the breakpoint gets set before the line of code that line of code will run. Basically, what will happen here is that the PHP script will open, line 3 will be run, but before we run line 5, the script will stop execution and hand back control to PhpStorm so we can inspect what's going on. So I've set my breakpoint. The second thing I need to remember to do is to listen to debug connections. which I can do right up here by just clicking the button, so that I've got the little green lines to say, yep, I'm listening to debug connections. And then we go back to our browser, which was this way. And again, I've got my own little extension here, which says enable Xdebug. Once I click this button and it's live, I'm now sending the cookie with every request. So now for me to debug. So if I refresh this page, you can see what happens is control is handed back to PhpStorm, and we've got some information in the debug pane right down here. So basically what we do right here is we're now stopped. So you can see we've hit this. You can see the first variable has been set. So these are the variables in the variable pane. So you can see the dice has been rolled, the random number generator has run the first time, and we've got a 10. And you can just see that we've got some global variables here in scope as well. The cookie that was being set by our browser extension, and notice that it's not even set in an IDE key that refers to the IDE we're using, because PhpStorm doesn't care about that stuff. And we've got our server variables, which are also in globals. So basically, that's the simplest introduction to debugging I can give you. We've enabled Xdebug, we've listened to debugging connections, and we've basically sent the cookie, and everything just hands back to PhpStorm. Left-hand side here, we can either play out this request by resuming program, or we can just stop here. So in this instance, we should get in the habit of finishing debug sessions before we move back to development, because if we don't do that, then you'll end up with like many open debug sessions, and things will not be predictable. So I need to remember to do that in this demo, but we'll just play out this request here, and we go back to the browser, and oh, what a bit of luck there, it was a match. So you can see that that's played out. Can I provide more information about settings for remote server and IDE? There isn't really any more things that you need to know about remote server. The configuration I showed earlier, which I'll make sure to publish somewhere, will work for remote environments. Yes, it's possible to use Xdebug in a PHP script that's open from JavaScript via Ajax. You just can send the cookie using, assuming you're using whichever JavaScript library, you can just add that Xdebug_session key as a query string parameter, and it will just work right off the bat, exactly the same way as I just showed you. It'll invoke the debugger. Okay, I'm not going to answer, Jacob. I'm not going to answer specific Xdebug questions here in this webinar. So let's move on right now. So the next thing we say is, okay, we've stopped execution. We can view exactly what's going on in the variables. That's kind of interesting and useful in itself. But really what we want to be able to do is to step debug, hence the term. So we need to be able to move the function, move the running of the PHP script along, so that we can examine exactly where execution goes and which conditions are met. And we can do that with a number of tools. So the first thing we can do that with is step over. So basically that just means move over the current code. Don't go into any functions that are called. Literally just step over them and show me the result effectively. So it's a really simple thing to demonstrate. So let's go back to our web browser here, and let's disable this breakpoint, because I tend to be in the habit where I tidy up after myself, so that I make sure that we actually don't have any breakpoints set that I'm not expected. So I'm going to open 2 now, and this is file 2. So you can see it's exactly the same as 1, but we've moved everything into its own function. So I will not talk about PHP debug, and I will be debugging a framework application later on. So yes, and Prison Architect's a reasonably good game, David. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, so we've just got a function here. So I'm just going to set my breakpoint in exactly the same place, and then move back. And we need to remember we've got our little helper enabled. We're listening to connections, which is good. We need to use the right file name. which is 2, if I can spell. And there you go, we've hit this. So if I step over, you can see that the result of running this user-defined function is just put into this variable. You can also see that we get these inline comments to tell us that the actual value of that variable right there. And we can just continue stepping over. This line highlighted here is the line of execution. This is completely pointless. This is a completely pointless piece of code right here, but hey, it's fine. And then we just keep going, and you can see that we can just step debug by going over things. Incredibly simple, but incredibly useful. So if we go back to our keynote, we can also step into things. Obviously, we can step over things. We also need to be able to step into things. Exactly the same concept as stepping over, but instead of skipping over what we're actually, the function we're running, we'll actually move into that function and see exactly what's going on. So that's kind of useful too. So I'm sure you can completely and utterly understand exactly what's going to go on here, but we'll run through it anyway. So instead of using step over, which is F8, I'm going to use step into, which is F7. So you can just see the execution moves into the function that we wanted, exactly the same way as it did before. Interestingly, if I close this file and open up 3.php, you can see that 3.php is exactly the same as 2.php, except we have the functions as a require. So we're not actually defining the function in the same file as the ones we're executing. And interestingly, if we debug this now, so I've set a breakpoint, I'm listening to connections. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. There you go. And then we just put 3 here. You can see that if I step into this, PhpStorm will actually open that file right up for me here. So it knows how to figure out which file it needs to move to. It knows how to map the files on the server to the files in our project. And we can continue to debug in exactly the same way as we did before. So it'll open the files up for you and move you about your application in exactly the way you would expect. And then the last thing that we're going to cover in the step in tools is step out. So when you move too far into a into a load of functions, so you're in, somebody mentioned Laravel in the questions, and you're inside a Laravel and you've stepped over your own user code and you've gone into the framework code in the vendor folder, and you're like, oh, I went too far. I didn't really want to be down this deep. And this is kind of the way that you can move backwards out of so you can move backwards the way out of the function that you came into by accident and move back to where that value is returned. So this is kind of useful too. And this is like a get out of jail free card, basically. When you get a bit excited and you go too fast. So in this instance, if we just refresh this page, we can step into the function here, and we're like, oh, I really didn't expect to be in this file. What am I doing here? Then we can just step out and go back to where we came from without having to step down deeper and deeper and deeper. This is like another thing that I use nearly every single time, where I step into instead of I step over by mistake, for example, which is kind of a common mistake. Being able to just get back out to there is really, really useful. So the question is, how will it work if you have multiple functions? It will step into them in the order that they are called. So in the example given, where if you have a function that is calling 2 functions, 1 for each argument, it will step into the first argument function first and then the second argument function afterwards. I'm confused how you got the PHP server in the configuration. I don't know what you mean there. I'm sorry. Please ping me on Twitter later if you need any more help. And how can Xdebug work on a remote server with PHP FPM enabled? You'll either need to change the port that PFPM is operating on or change the port that Xdebug is operating on. Assuming you change the port that Xdebug is operating on, you just need to add 1 extra line to your PHP and configuration to say which port to work on, and then 1 line, and then edit PhpStorm's configuration to tell it to listen on that port too. There's more documentation on how to do that at the end. Yeah, I'm not going to answer your questions if you put them all in capitalization. Sorry. Step into equals F7, not F9. Step into is F7, step over is F8, and step out is Shift F8 in this the default Mac configuration. And the theme, yes, I meant to mention that earlier. This is Material Theme, which is a plugin you can get right from within PhpStorm. And the color scheme then is, you'll find it on GitHub, is Material Theme Peacock, which you can find on GitHub. Yes, the slides will be available afterwards. I'll tweet them out. And another point which is definitely worth mentioning by Ricky is that, yes, if you step into a ton of files, you will have a load of file tabs open afterwards. You notice that I only ever have one tab open. I don't like to have multiple tabs, and then I use Shift Command and E to open recent files. This is kind of a way that I find which is neater to do it than having hundreds and hundreds of tabs open. But no, there's not really any way you can do that aside from limiting. You can limit the number of tabs PhpStorm will open, which is a useful thing to do when you're using these tools. Okay, so we're running out of time, so let's I like the fact that there's tons of questions, but obviously we need to get through this. So the next thing to mention is that you can actually run more advanced breakpoints, which is kind of useful. Okay, sorry, before I move on, the question was from Gary Ehrenfeld, I thought this was going to be shown how to set up the debug in PhpStorm. I didn't need to set up the debug in PhpStorm. That's the whole point here. The whole point is that with zero configuration debugging, I only need to set up debugging outside of PhpStorm. PhpStorm basically, when it hears the debug connection, coming into PhpStorm, it will basically assume it's for PhpStorm and just start debugging. You may need to actually, you may find that if you have weird path maps, so for example, if you're using Vagrant, again, this should work perfectly well because the path mappings are defined already. If you're using some kind of virtualization or containerization that is has like atypical path mappings, and you're not using Composer, you have like what's the word I'm looking for? If you have a, excuse me, while I try and remember what I'm thinking about. If you have, for example, external libraries here, and you have include paths is the term I was looking for. If you have atypical include paths, you may find you have to specifically tell PhpStorm how to map the files on the remote server to the files on the local system. But in 90% normal use case, you do not need to configure PhpStorm. It will just start working when you're listening. That's a good point. So, yeah, we can view breakpoints. So we can do more advanced breakpoints by using the view breakpoints pane from within the breakpoint within the debugging panel. So this is a really good example where you really need to try and find problems that aren't happening on every single request. So, for example, you may find that exceptions are being thrown, but they're not being thrown on every single request that you do. So you find that it's a very hit and miss, intermittent problem, but you do need to debug this, but you can't, you don't want to debug it every time. So there's a way that you can easily catch the exceptions and start the debugging session then, or you can use conditions to only start debugging sessions on certain conditions. So if we look at 4.php, so essentially what's happening here, excuse me, essentially what's happening here is that basically this is a really, really bad way for me to show how you could have unpredictable exceptions, unpredictable code results because of exceptions. So in this instance, if we look at get pseudo random number with exceptions, the maximum number that we can run if I don't pass any parameter in is 5. If the number that we roll is equal to the maximum number, in this case 5, we throw an exception. But if I go back to the the script that's calling this, that exception gets swallowed and the number gets set to 1. So this is an example where we have like really weird behavior and we can't figure out what's going on because it doesn't happen every time. Now, of course, you wouldn't normally get this behavior from random numbers. You may get this from database situations that don't happen for every user or whatever, you know. So this is a way that you can easily catch those situations. So what we want to do here is hit the view breakpoints button, which is weird because it's not just viewing breakpoints, it's adding them and editing them too. So we want to create a PHP exception breakpoint, and we want to set that exception that we want to break on to be an invalid argument exception, because of course we're PHP developers. When we don't know which exception to use, we always use invalid argument. So I got code completion there, which is kind of nice. Looking in here, and this is the same for any kind of breakpoint, we can also set a condition. So we can say, okay, only actually do this if first non-random number is equal to 5 or something. We could actually set a condition in here if we wanted to. Anything at all that would evaluate as an if statement in PHP will work as a condition right there. So we've set our exception. Exception breakpoint to be enabled and suspend on an invalid argument exception. So if we now make sure that we're listening here, which we are, and if we go back to our browser and fire up 4.php, now, that was kind of useful. So I wasn't expecting that to fire the first time because it was a 1 in 5 chance that it would fire, but it did fire, which is kind of nice because it saves us some time. So you can see that the exception has thrown here. Here's the exception, and the exception is thrown because the random number that's not really random is 5. The maximum is 5. This clause has been met, therefore the exception has been thrown. So we can just continue debugging now. So we go back up, we can see this exception has been caught, and we're setting the first random number, and then we can continue working through the script to find out exactly what was going on and why we were having this weird intermittent problem. So, and I've stopped this session, which is good. So, Marco Conti, I will answer your question shortly. Can I know that only one file per session can be debugged? No, as I mentioned earlier, all of the files will be debugged. They'll be opened in the browser when they get requested. So there we go. So the other thing I'd like to show, there's a couple more things I need to show, so we've got enough time, I think, is the console. This is really, really cool. So the console allows you to view and manipulate variables and classes and everything else on the fly. So I'm going to really quickly show you this because we are running behind because I've been answering too many questions. If we open PhpStorm up right again, and let's set a breakpoint right here. So this is a pointless line of code, but we'll set a breakpoint there anyway. And, that's what we need to do, because when I've given this before, this has always caught me, is disable this exception breakpoint. Otherwise, I'll get weird breaks that I'm not expecting. So that's fine. So if we head back here and refresh, you can see we've stopped here. So at this point, we've got first run non-random number and second non-random number, and we've got pointless wasted code, but let's run it anyway. So I can now go to the console, and this is like really familiar to anyone who's debugged JavaScript this way using Firebug or Chrome Developer Tools or whatever the current software is for doing that kind of thing. So what I can do here is exactly what you would expect from JavaScript developer console. So I can say first non-random number, okay, that's 13, that's great. Second non-random number, okay, that's 1. I can also assign these, so I can say second non-random number equals 13, and that's modified the value of that variable to be 13. Interestingly, I can also run functions from in here, so I can say, okay, I want to rerun the get pseudo random number function right from within the console with a maximum of 100. And we can run that, and you can see that's run successfully, and second non-random number is now 80. So we can manipulate everything and look around the application state right from within the console, which is really, really handy. I really find this to be a really, really useful way to to manipulate objects, which I'll come to later on when I show you like a much more concrete example than these really simple scripts I'm using right here. But yeah, it is particularly useful for those kind of things. Okay, let's make sure this debug session and stop this breakpoint. Yeah, the console is really useful, and I would encourage you to have a play around with that. It's kind of cool. So, oh, sorry, there is a question about console. Console is more for input and manipulation, but not for output. Well, really, you can't actually do any output. Well, you could if it was a command line script, like we're going to say right now. Anything you echo will go to the command line, but it's like pointless, because why would you need to output anything? You know, you're not trying to write to the browser or to the actual command line output buffer. You're just trying to work out exactly what's going on to fix your scripts. So you wouldn't typically use this for output. Why does the session have to be stopped? If you already have a PhpStorm, sorry, if you already have an Xdebug session running on port 9000, you'll just forget that it's running, and when you come to start another session, nothing will work, and you'll end up getting confused. It's not going to harm anything, but it is kind of useful. Is there a possibility to skip some parts of the code, like library code, some kind of black boxes file? That's a really good question, and one I'm not 100% of the answer to. But we would be interested in doing a more advanced debugging webinar later on. So if there's any more questions like that, please pop them into the questions, and we'll either do a blog post or another webinar to answer those. No, it's impossible to step back. The question is there any way to step back? It's impossible to step back because execution has already happened, and there's no way to actually know what the last state was to move backwards. So it's actually impossible to step backwards. The author of Xdebug, Derek Ruthens, is thinking about doing a new version of Xdebug where it remembers the state at every step, so you can move backwards and forwards through a request, but it's not possible to do that at the moment. How to debug with Xdebug in PHP CLI? Well, that's a really good question, and one I'm literally about to answer on screen. So to move on to the command line, so there's obviously multiple times where you'll want to debug command line scripts. The command line scripts are, if you're writing your own command line application, or if you're running TDD, you're using PHP spec, or you're using PHP unit, or you generally just want to debug a command line script, then you need to be able to do that. So one of the ways you can do that is to basically just run your command line script with an exported variable set. You can find more information on the links I'll give you at the end on how to do that. The way I love to do it is to use the just-in-time configuration. So if you're like me and you've had Xdebug installed on your PHP CLI installed for years, you'll notice that recently Composer has started putting a yellow bar saying, you have Xdebug enabled, and this really slows everything down. Please remove it to run Composer. So this is kind of common. And yes, to answer several questions that came that I haven't answered because I knew I was going to be talking about this, having Xdebug enabled massively slows down your PHP scripts. So that's a point of note. It really does slow things down quite a lot. There's a heck of a lot more under the hood kind of stuff going on than if you were not running Xdebug. It does a ton more stuff, so it's much, much slower, which is why if you have Xdebug enabled for your command line all of the time, basically your Composer will slow down tons, and running your unit tests when you don't need to debug, they'll slow down tons too. So there's a way you can debug command line really easily from within PhpStorm and not have your Xdebug enabled across the board globally for your whole PHP CLI install. So let's take a look. So we're on 4. This is a perfect example. We're on 4. Imagine we wanted to run this as a command line script. Basically what we do, if I open my terminal here and run PHP-V, which I did last time when I was practicing this. You can see I don't have Xdebug enabled here. I'm running PHP 7.0.9, but I don't have Xdebug enabled. So what we can do then is, if I open up my interpreter options, and I always use this method for finding the configuration stuff I want, Command-Shift-A on Mac, search actions or options, allows you to actually search the preferences pane right from within your IDE, which is kind of useful. So if we open up my interpreter options, you can see that if I now move across to my PHP interpreter options, there's this place here where it tells me I can give the location of the debugger extension on my file system. So this debugger is not actually loaded unless I ask PhpStorm to run a script in debug mode, basically. So you can see that if I refresh this, without the debugger, it's not installed. If I add the O back on, it's installed. So it's basically PhpStorm knows where to find my debugger, so we can enable it just in time when I need to debug. So this is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop listening. We don't need to listen to actually listen when we're debugging command line scripts in this way. Excuse me. I have a terrible sore throat, so this is not the best thing to be doing today, but it's all good. So what we can do here is, if I want to run this script, we could create a configuration up here to run this as a PHP run configuration. But the easiest way to do this is to just right-click on it, and then we can run our debug right from within this file. So if I click run for, you can see that this script is run inside PhpStorm's runner, and the Boolean false is returned. So if I want to now debug this, I can just set a breakpoint somewhere. It doesn't really matter. Right click on it and then do debug for.php. And you can see that it's actually, if you look at the console, it's done the command line that I need to enable this, debugger just in time, and it's configured it completely for me so that I can actually step debug this command line script. So you can see that I've got a server here and globals, but I don't have a cookie anymore because I'm not actually doing a HTTP request. And we can step over this and into it and out of it exactly the same way we would be able to do from anywhere else. So this is pretty cool. The other point of note here, which is a kind of a bonus, although I hope we'll get this built into the IDE quite soon, is what you can do is you can copy this, you can copy all of these command line parameters, and if you're like me and you use the built-in PHP web server to serve up your development environment, you can actually configure that from within PhpStorm and pass this interpreter options here. So now you have Xdebug running just in time for the PHP web server whenever you run that, or for any debugging you need to do on command line scripts. If you're using the PHP unit test runner, you can use the debug button and it will work in exactly the same way as I've just done. So there's an absolute ton of questions to answer right here. So bear with me for one moment. If you have a function that's called from different classes, is there a way to add a breakpoint only if the call comes from a specific class? Yes, you can use a conditional. You can use a conditional to say, okay, only break if the parameter that was passed in equals true or false or whatever combination you need. The just-in-time configuration works perfectly with Docker environments because you'll have configured your interpreter in the interpreter screen to be a remote interpreter, and then you'll just browse to the local path in the Docker container to say where Xdebug is, and it works exactly the same way as it did in the way that I just showed you here. Yeah, so the same question for Halil. Yeah, you'll have already configured your interpreter to be remote. Therefore, the path you put to your xdebug.so file will be on the local system. Okay, so we have nothing running here. This is good. Let's go back to the slides. So The last thing I want to cover, which I guess is what most people, or a few people have been interested in, is how does this work in terms of a complex object-oriented application? Actually, it works better in a complex object-oriented application. So what I need to do is to stop this PHP web server in this project where I've just had really, really simple demonstration files. Then I'm going to use command and backtick to move to my other project. This is a Zen framework project, but you know, these ideas here are absolutely and utterly useful. Framework, CMS, WordPress, Laravel, Joomla. You know, these thoughts are exactly the same no matter what framework or object-oriented programming you're using. In fact, debugging is more useful when you're working in a more complex environment for obvious reasons. So this is a really bad Zen framework application. Please forgive that. The only reason it's really bad is it allows me to demonstrate this stuff really nicely and cleanly. So assuming that we have the run, did I run that? No. So assuming that we run this, then we get the little green dot. So now we have a website we can actually serve up. Let's stop debugging so I can just check that this is running. Okay, so all we're doing is grabbing a list of countries from a database and displaying them in screen, but we're using Zen Framework 2 to do it. So pretty simple. I've stopped listening in this project. Again, this can be a bit of a downfall. When you're listening to multiple projects, it can be painful. So just tidying up after yourself is kind of best practice. So I'm listening here now, and I'm going to set a breakpoint right here in this action where we basically pull a table gateway and we run a select on the database and convert it to array, and then we return it to the view. So this should be pretty straightforward for anyone who uses OOP style frameworks. Then if I go back here and refresh, nothing. Oh, yeah, again, I didn't set my little bug to be running. So if I refresh again, hooray, it actually worked. So we can go right down here, and you can see that now we're in a position where we have much more interesting information available. So the first thing to notice is we have this in scope. So I can see the scope of the object I'm actually in and executing right now, which is completely and utterly useful. Obviously, we've got the countries that we've just created here is available. It's an array of country objects, which is nice. Oh, actually, it's an array of arrays because I called toArray on it. This is super useful. If you look in the left-hand pane, what was pretty much useless information in the early examples, you can now see a stack trace of exactly where execution has gone up to this point. So starting from the index.php, we worked all the way down to line 21, where we did an application in it. That is terrible colors, but hey, it'll work. And then we went to application and we ran until events trigger, and then the event manager kicked in, and I'm using the up and down arrows to move around these stack traces. We hit the dispatch listener, the abstract controller then took over and did some stuff. The event manager fired again, then the abstract action controller did some stuff, and then we eventually got into our index controller. So we can see exactly where we've been to this point inside the objects that have been invoked up to this point. This is really, really super useful. This will work like in any file at all. The question is confusing, but you could set this breakpoint inside controller code in your vendor folder, inside framework code in your vendor controller. You could set it anywhere you wanted, basically, and it would all work. Can you remove all active breakpoints? Yeah, you can view them right here, and then you can just tick or untick them from the view breakpoints pane in the left-hand side. The useful thing here now is basically, okay, so let's just run through this again, and you can see that this is just basically continued running. The interesting thing here is the console also now becomes much more useful. So let's just quickly step through to see how this works before we look at the console. If I step into this, you can see that I'm in the constructor for the view model here because I've just created a new view model, and then we can step over that. Oh, it's setting some variables, and I can also use the step out to get out of where I came, as I said earlier. Fortunately, we're deep in the dispatch code of the Xen framework now. So even stepping out isn't taking me back to where I came because it was the last line in a method. But you can see that we can basically step right into, deep into the vendor folder, into the code that is being called here, which is kind of useful. But equally as useful is if we restart this. Okay, so I'm in the scope here. So I now have in my console full access to exactly what's going on here. So you can see that this is action controller. So we have tons of stuff already here for us. So for example, I can say this URL and it'll actually run the method. At this point, the method's returned nothing, but if it did, it would actually give us the output there. Also useful is I can call methods. For example, here I can say forward to the URL Google. This is forward is a method of the Xen framework that allows you to, redirect. I want not forward, my apologies. Forward would forward us to another action. So I can say redirect to the URL http google.com. And you can see that if I run that, the redirect is just a shortcut. So it returns a response. So if I actually now play this out and go back to the browser, you can see that it's actually redirected me because I set up the state of my framework to be what I actually wanted it to be, and then played out the request. And so everything that I'd set up in the console was actually part of that invocation of PHP, and therefore everything got played out nicely. So let me quickly look through the rest of the questions because we are fast out of time. So I just want to quickly mention about debugging remotely using Vagrant before we move on. Using Vagrant or using Docker or using any kind of other virtualized environment, even if you're using a dev server on a different machine, it still works the same way. Essentially, when you set up your interpreter for a remote environment, this is the screen for setting up your interpreter. So in here, you would set up a remote interpreter if you were working with Vagrant or if you were working via SSH or whatever else. This is where you would set up your interpreter. And once you set up the interpreter, this screen then allows you to browse on the local machine. Because the remote interpreter is on the remote local machine, the interpreter is just the PHP executable, wherever that may be. So to think about it, when you're using Vagrant or any other method, you can basically have the interpreter remotely here. And then that means that it all works itself out for you. So when you run this as a command line script, it actually runs it as a command line script in the Vagrant box or the Docker container that you're using. So this kind of, as long as you've got this part configured correctly, the rest of it sorts itself out. You can see there's this page on the documentation page on debugging, PhpStorm/documentation/debugging. I'll make sure that gets included with the slides as well. That gives you fairly comprehensive information about how to debug easily and quickly. Let us know on Twitter if you have any more questions, or let us know if there's any more things you'd like to see covered in webinars like these. Thank you very much for your time. And yeah, I hope you all debug successfully when you get back to working. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you, Gary, for a great presentation. I believe many people will find it extremely useful, including me. So if you want to learn more about PhpStorm, please visit our website. You can leave your feedback on Twitter to Gary or to PhpStorm. So if you have any questions, you can also ask them on Twitter. We will reply them. And as we said, the recording will be available at JetBrains TV very soon, probably beginning of next week. And so follow us on Twitter and blog, and see you at the next webinars.